Tonight, we're delving into the raw, the exhilarating, and the decidedly unglamorous reality of a substance that once held the promise of everything, far removed from its silver screen portrayals. Living its truth was utterly draining. So before you settle in, please take a moment to acknowledge this video with a like, and consider subscribing, but only if you genuinely find value in what I present. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? It's always incredibly insightful to see the global reach of our audience. Let's set our phones aside, keep the volume low, and immerse ourselves in the thin, biting air of the high Andes, where each breath is a hard-won prize and the sun reigns with unforgiving intensity. A humble green leaf offered more than mere sustenance. For countless generations, it was revered, almost sacred. Long before empires of glittering gold emerged, and before the sails of Spanish galleons marred the distant sea, there was cocoa, the leaf of the divine. Its ancient origins are shrouded in the deep history of South America, leaving behind whispers in the archaeological record that stretch back at least 8,000 years. Traces of its distinctive alkaloid have been discovered within the preserved remains of individuals from the Peruvian coast, their bodies meticulously wrapped in fine fabrics and interred with a small pouch, a chuspa, containing a carefully dried cluster of these leaves. This was no casual indulgence. It represented a profound pact between humanity and the formidable, challenging terrain. The plant itself is quite unassuming, essentially a shrub with vibrant oval green leaves and small, delicate white flowers that eventually yield to crimson berries. It thrives in the moist, steep slopes of the Yungas, the eastern Andean foothills, a vertiginous, precarious world where clouds embrace the mountainsides. It was here that ancient civilizations mastered the art of terracing the earth, constructing intricate stone walls that ascended towards the heavens, creating ascending platforms for the cultivation of their esteemed crop. For the Inca, the culmination of Andean empires, this leaf was the very heart of their existence. They revered it as Mama Coca, a feminine deity, a benevolent gift bestowed by the sun god Inti to alleviate the suffering of his people. Yet, this gift was not freely given, nor was it accessible to all. The Inca state was a masterpiece of centralized administration, a vast, meticulously planned dominion unified by an extensive network of paved stone roadways. Coca was a strictly controlled resource. Its usage was a privilege jealously guarded, reserved exclusively for the Sapa Inca himself, the royal court, the high priests, and a select few other sanctioned individuals. When the priest sought communion with the divine or guidance on matters of the future, they would chew a quid of the leaves, the bundle held in their cheek, slowly releasing its potent effects. The patterns formed by the leaves when cast upon a ceremonial cloth were interpreted as divine omens, dictating decisions of state, warfare, and even matters of life and death. For any high-ranking official undertaking a journey, a ration of coca would be provided. Similarly, when a laborer was conscripted for the mita, the mandatory public service that facilitated the construction of Cusco's magnificent temples and the formidable fortresses of Machu Picchu, they received a daily allowance of these leaves. This was not for personal enjoyment. It served as essential fuel, suppressing the gnawing pangs of hunger, dulling the relentless ache of exhaustion, and warding off the debilitating effects of high-altitude sickness. The arteries of the empire were its roads, and its lifeblood flowed through the chasqui, the imperial messengers. These individuals constituted the Inca's communication network, a relay system of runners capable of traversing the distance from Quito to Cusco, over 1,000 miles, in less than a week. They would sprint with punishing intensity, from one small stone outpost to the next, the coca leaf their constant companion. It granted them the fortitude to conquer treacherous mountain passes, to run until their lungs burned, and to deliver the emperor's messages before their relevance waned. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in 1532 observed this practice through the rigid filter of their own religious convictions and perceived only idolatry. The Catholic clergy denounced it as a tool of the devil, an obstacle to conversion. Initial edicts from the Spanish crown aimed to completely prohibit its cultivation and use. However, this moral steadfastness soon encountered a far more potent force: economics. The Spanish had not journeyed to the New World primarily for the salvation of souls. Their objective was silver, and deep within the earth, at a hellish altitude of 13,000 feet, they discovered a mountain composed entirely of it: Potosi. To extract the silver from the mountain's core, they required labor, an inexhaustible supply of expendable workers. They appropriated and perverted the existing Mita system, compelling tens of thousands of indigenous men into the dark, suffocating tunnels. The labor was brutal, the conditions lethal. Men perished from cave-ins, from mercury poisoning incurred during the refining process, and from sheer, unremitting exhaustion. The Spanish quickly and pragmatically recognized what the Inca had understood all along. The coca leaf could enable humans to work beyond the limits of their endurance. It allowed mine owners to provide less food to their workers, to push them harder, and to extract more silver at a reduced cost. Consequently, the church's opposition waned. The very priests who had once branded coca as the work of Satan now found themselves owning coca plantations. The leaf, once a sacred privilege, transformed into a form of payment, a mechanism of colonial oppression. It became the lubricant for the colossal extraction machinery that funneled the wealth of the Andes into the coffers of the Spanish monarchy, fueling the golden age of an empire situated halfway across the world. For 3 centuries, the leaf remained rooted in its mountainous homeland, a local sacrament and a source of local sorrow, its true potential locked away, awaiting the inquisitive minds of another continent to unlock it. That key was turned, not in a temple, but within a laboratory. As the 19th century dawned, European scientific inquiry was in a frenzy of discovery, meticulously dissecting the natural world and cataloguing its constituent elements. Botanists and chemists were captivated by alkaloids, those potent, nitrogen-containing compounds found in plants. They had already successfully isolated morphine from the opium poppy, quinine from cinchona bark, and caffeine from coffee beans. The unassuming coca leaf, which had begun arriving in Europe in dried bundles, presented a natural and compelling subject for scientific investigation. In 1855, a German chemist named Friedrich Geidke succeeded in isolating a crude, yellowish substance, which he termed erythroxyline. However, the process was inefficient, and the yield was impure. The definitive breakthrough occurred 5 years later, in 1860, in the tranquil university town of Göttingen. A graduate student named Albert Niemann, working under the renowned chemist Friedrich Wöhler, refined the extraction process, employing a meticulous series of chemical washes and distillations. He extracted a pure, crystalline alkaloid, white, odorless, and bitter. In his dissertation, he described how a few crystals placed on his tongue induced a temporary numbness, a fleeting, deadening sensation. He bestowed upon this novel substance its proper scientific designation, derived from the plant itself and the standard alkaloid suffix, cocaine. The world, however, did not immediately take notice. The discovery initially languished in academic journals, a mere footnote in the grand narrative of chemical advancement. Its reintroduction to the global stage came not through scientific pursuit, but through commerce, accompanied by a glass of wine. Angelo Mariani, a shrewd Corsican entrepreneur in Paris, experienced an epiphany. He recognized that the European populace was experiencing widespread fatigue, anxiety, and an enchantment with the concept of scientific tonics that could purportedly restore their vitality. In 1863, he began importing vast quantities of high-quality Peruvian coca leaves and steeping them in fine Bordeaux wine. The alcohol acted as a solvent, effectively extracting the cocaine from the leaves and creating a potent, palatable elixir. He christened it Vin Mariani. It became an immense sensation. Mariani was a marketing virtuoso, arguably the first of his kind. He solicited endorsements from virtually every prominent figure of the era. Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius IX both lauded its virtues, with Leo even bestowing upon Mariani a Vatican gold medal. Queen Victoria herself partook of it. Thomas Edison credited it with aiding his sustained efforts through lengthy nights of invention. Ulysses S. Grant sipped it while composing his memoirs, battling throat cancer. Literary giants such as Émile Zola and Jules Verne penned glowing tributes. Mariani's advertisements proliferated, proclaiming his coca wine as the ultimate remedy for fatigue, melancholy, and general malaise. It was the perfect tonic for the frenetic energy of the Belle Époque.
The logistical undertaking was remarkable, establishing a global supply chain that stretched from the high Andes to a Parisian laboratory, from which millions of bottles of this cocaine-infused wine were then dispatched to a receptive world. America, ever eager to build upon European success, soon followed suit. In Atlanta, Georgia, a pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton was grappling with his own personal struggles. A Confederate veteran wounded during the Civil War, he had become addicted to morphine, a common affliction among former soldiers treated with the powerful painkiller. Seeking a remedy for his own dependence and inspired by Mariani's triumph, he concocted Pemberton's French wine coca. It was essentially an American iteration of Vin Mariani and quickly gained popularity. However, in 1886, Pemberton's venture encountered a local obstacle. Fulton County enacted prohibition, rendering alcohol unavailable. Undeterred, Pemberton scrambled to reformulate his tonic. He substituted the wine base with a sugary syrup and carbonated water, added an extract from the caffeine-rich cola nut for an extra boost, and retained the coca leaf extract. He named his new, temperance-friendly creation, Coca-Cola. The elixir of life was thus born, sold from soda fountains as a cure for headaches, nervousness, and exhaustion. Each serving contained a not inconsiderable dose of cocaine, a fact the company now understandably downplays, but which was at the time its primary selling point. While entrepreneurs were actively intoxicating the public, the medical establishment was also catching up, largely due to the fervent advocacy of a young, ambitious Viennese neurologist, Sigmund Freud. In 1884, Freud was still years away from developing psychoanalysis. He was a struggling researcher seeking a discovery that would establish his reputation and fortune. He chanced upon reports detailing cocaine's effects and commenced experimenting on himself. He experienced profound euphoria. In his seminal paper, Uber Coca, he extolled the substance in rapturous terms. He declared it a miracle drug, a panacea for depression, a stimulant that induced a sensation of exhilaration and lasting euphoria without any adverse effects. Most dangerously, he promoted it as a treatment for morphine addiction. He administered it to his patients, his friends, and even his fiancée Martha, believing it would imbue her with strength and a healthy complexion. Freud's considerable intellectual authority lent cocaine a stamp of legitimacy it had previously lacked. It was no longer merely an ingredient in a popular tonic. It was regarded as a serious therapeutic agent. His work inspired a colleague, the ophthalmologist Carl Koller, to investigate Niemann's initial observation regarding its numbing properties. In a series of brilliant experiments, Koller discovered that a solution of cocaine applied to the eye rendered it completely insensitive to pain. In 1884, he demonstrated his findings by performing surgery on the eye of a fully conscious animal, and subsequently a human, without any indication of distress. The assembled physicians were astonished. This marked the advent of local anesthesia, revolutionizing surgery, particularly in delicate fields such as ophthalmology and dentistry. Prior to cocaine, such procedures were either performed with brutal speed or conducted on patients rendered unconscious with ether or chloroform. Now, a surgeon could meticulously operate on a specific body part while the patient remained awake and pain-free. During the final 2 decades of the 19th century, cocaine reigned supreme. It was the wonder drug of the Victorian era, a panacea for the modern age. The American pharmaceutical company Parke Davis offered it in every conceivable form: powders, cigarettes, hypodermic injection kits, complete with vials of cocaine hydrochloride and even a Coca-Cola-inspired soft drink of their own, branded Coca-Cola. One could procure cocaine-infused throat lozenges for singers and public speakers and teasing drops for infants experiencing discomfort. It was loaded in medical journals, advertised in popular magazines, and consumed by millions who genuinely believed they were simply utilizing a sophisticated, scientifically validated remedy for the stresses of daily existence. The leaf of the Andes had been stripped of its essence, its alkaloid isolated and amplified, its power unleashed upon a world utterly captivated by its promise and woefully unprepared for its cost. The descent from grace was as precipitous as the ascent had been spectacular. The hushed warnings, previously dismissed as mere anecdotal observations, soon swelled into a chorus of alarm. The miracle cure began to reveal its sinister underbelly. Physicians started to document a disturbing new pattern among their patients, and all too frequently among themselves. Individuals who had initially resorted to cocaine for melancholy or fatigue found themselves incapable of ceasing its use. The initial euphoria gave way to paranoia, restlessness, and terrifying hallucinations. A common manifestation was the sensation of insects crawling beneath the skin, a phenomenon that became known as cocaine bugs or formication. The promise of enhanced performance devolved into compulsive, repetitive behaviors and a complete breakdown of judgment. The wonder drug was engendering a new and particularly insidious form of addiction. No case served as a more damning indictment than one that emerged from Sigmund Freud's own circle. He had enthusiastically treated his close friend, Dr. Ernst von Flies-Marlow, for morphine addiction by prescribing him substantial doses of cocaine. The outcome was catastrophic. Flies-Marlow traded one addiction for another, far more destructive one. He succumbed to a full-blown cocaine psychosis, ravaged by paranoid delusions and the incessant torment of phantom white snakes crawling across his skin. He died a few years later, a broken man. This experience profoundly disturbed Freud. He ceased his public advocacy for cocaine and rarely spoke of it again. However, the damage had already been done. The genie he had inadvertently helped release from its bottle was now wreaking havoc on the lives of individuals across Europe and America. The public perception began to shift, fueled by sensationalist media, eager for a new scapegoat. Where advertisements had once extolled cocaine's virtues, newspaper headlines now screamed about its vices, with accounts of high society scandals, promising careers ruined and fortunes squandered on the white powder becoming commonplace. But the moral panic manifested in its most sinister and enduring form in the United States, where it became inextricably and deliberately intertwined with the nation's deepest racial anxieties. In the American South, lurid and entirely unsubstantiated stories began to circulate, alleging that cocaine use was rampant among African American laborers. These narratives were deliberately crafted to incite white fear. Newspapers printed sensationalized reports of cocaine-crazed Negroes committing heinous crimes with superhuman strength and cunning. A prominent article published in the New York Times in 1914, authored by a physician named Edward H. Williams, claimed that cocaine rendered black men more accurate marksmen and made them temporarily immune to pistol bullets. Southern police departments even began equipping themselves with higher caliber revolvers, citing the necessity of greater stopping power against these supposedly drug-fueled maniacs. This was a calculated racial mythology, effectively transforming the cocaine user from a pitiable, often white middle-class victim of a medical fad into a dangerous black criminal predator. The drug was no longer simply a personal failing. It was perceived as a threat to the social order, a catalyst for racial conflict, demanding a swift and decisive governmental response. The mechanisms of federal regulation, which had been operating at a slow pace, began to accelerate. An early and crucial step was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906.
Driven by investigative journalists exposing the fraudulent and often perilous contents of patent medicines, the law did not outright ban any substances. Instead, it mandated accurate labeling. For the first time, companies were compelled to list ingredients such as alcohol, morphine, and cocaine on their product packaging. The impact was immediate. Consumers were shocked to discover that the soothing syrups administered to their children contained opiates, and that their favored pick-me-up tonics were heavily laden with cocaine. Facing public outcry and the threat of declining sales, many manufacturers quietly reformulated their products. It was around 1903, even before the law was enacted, that the Coca-Cola Company, sensitive to the shifting public sentiment, removed the active cocaine alkaloid from its flagship beverage, switching to a decocainized coca leaf extract to preserve its name and flavor profile. However, labeling alone proved insufficient for the growing chorus of reformers, temperance advocates, and race baiters who were demanding complete prohibition. The international diplomatic arena provided the final impetus. The United States, seeking to expand its influence in Asia, desired to assist China in curtailing its devastating opium epidemic. To possess the moral authority to lead international anti-drug conventions, America first needed to address its own domestic issues.
The result was the culmination of 2 decades of escalating alarm. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, often referred to as the Harrison Act. The Harrison Act was not a prohibition law. It was framed as a tax law, a piece of revenue legislation designed to withstand constitutional challenges. It stipulated that any individual importing, manufacturing, selling, or distributing cocaine and opiates must register with the federal government, pay a special tax, and utilize specific order forms. On its surface, it appeared to be a straightforward regulatory measure. However, its enforcement fundamentally altered American society. Treasury Department agents tasked with enforcing the act interpreted its provisions in the most stringent manner possible. They ruled that prescribing narcotics to an addict to sustain their habit did not constitute legitimate medical practice. Physicians who continued to do so faced harassment, arrest, and prosecution, with many ultimately being incarcerated. The medical profession, intimidated, rapidly distanced itself from treating addiction altogether. The consequences were profound and immediate. The supply of legal cocaine, once readily available over the counter at any pharmacy, vanished. The user, who a decade prior had been perceived as a patient or a consumer, was now legally redefined as a criminal. The act did not eradicate cocaine use. It merely drove it underground. It effectively closed the doors of pharmacies and soda fountains, and in doing so, opened a new, darker portal, one that led to the back alley, the illicit dealer, and the vast, violent, and immensely profitable black market. The era of cocaine as a medical miracle had concluded. Its reign as a public enemy and as the fuel for a century of crime and conflict was just beginning. With the stroke of a pen and the self-righteous conviction of lawmakers, the crystalline powder was banished. Driven from the sunlit counters of pharmacies and the cheerful effervescence of soda fountains, it did not, of course, disappear. It simply found its way into the hands of a different sort of individual. Prohibition, you see, rarely eradicates a desire. It merely escalates the price and curates the clientele. And so, cocaine, stripped of its medical legitimacy, underwent a remarkable transformation. It became a secret. And secrets, especially significant ones, are among the most coveted status symbols. The powder became the clandestine handshake of the new elite, a glittering communion for those who lived ahead of the curve, or simply above the law. In the Roaring Twenties, an era intoxicated by bathtub gin and giddy with rebellion, cocaine was the quintessential accessory. It was the phantom in the machine of the jazz age. In the hazy, blue, smoke-filled speakeasies of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, where the frantic energy of the Charleston shook the very floorboards, a small, discreet vial served as a badge of membership in the inner circle. It was fast, it was modern, it was outrageously illegal. It was everything the era celebrated. For the flapper, with her bobbed hair and newfound freedoms,
It was a means to dance until dawn. For the Wall Street speculator, flushed with cash from a market that seemed to perpetually ascend, it was a way to feel as invincible as his portfolio. The substance was spoken of in hushed tones, offered discreetly in the powder rooms of grand hotels or the back seats of rumbling automobiles. It was the fuel for a party that was never intended to end. A potent chemical promise foretold a decade and a night ablaze, burning with an intensity and speed unmatched by any before. This clandestine fraternity of excess maintained a Western outpost, naturally, within a sun-drenched locale engrossed in crafting the nation's aspirations. Hollywood, in the ephemeral, soundless era of early film, was such a place. The pressures were immense. Fortunes could materialize overnight, and an obscure girl from Ohio might ascend to divine status within months. Her likeness projected 30 feet high, for the veneration of millions. The studios demanded ceaseless energy and a perpetually dazzling persona, both on and off the silver screen. In this intense environment of burgeoning fame, a small white powder found fertile ground. It was affectionately termed girl or nose candy, a playful moniker for a demanding chemical mistress. It served as the pre-show boost for lengthy night shoots beneath scorching Klieg lights, and as the social solvent at decadent weekend soirees in Laurel Canyon Estates. It was the unseen partner in the meteoric ascents and tragic descents of countless stars. The demise of heartthrob Wallace Reed in 23, officially attributed to morphine addiction following an injury, offered the public a brief, unsettling glimpse behind the glamour's curtain. This scandal sent tremors through studio executives, not due to the human toll, but the potential impact on box office revenue. The industry attempted self-regulation through the Hays Code, a new set of moral strictures. Yet this only served to drive the secrets deeper underground, making them even more alluring to those who could afford them. This powder was not solely for the pleasure seekers. It also permeated the circles of intellectuals, writers, and artists. In the bohemian quarters of Greenwich Village and the smoky Parisian cafes of the post-war era, cocaine was not seen as mere indulgence, but as a key to unlocking perception, shattering banality, and fueling creative endeavors through the solitary early morning hours. For the surrealist painter, it offered fleeting, jagged visions. For the novelist grappling with an epic American narrative, it provided the means to sustain the flow of words, to overcome exhaustion and self-doubt. It was perceived as a tool, a cognitive enhancer capable of sharpening the mind and peeling back the layers of perceived reality. This, of course, was a captivating yet perilous deception. The creativity it appeared to foster was often merely frenzied, unfocused energy, and the profound insights were merely circular, self-referential meanderings of deranged brain chemistry. Nevertheless, the myth held sway, cloaking the drug in an aura of intellectual gravitas, transforming it into a sacrament for the avant-garde. And who supplied this clandestine world, bridging the gap between Hollywood starlets and Parisian poets? The criminal underworld. Naturally, the same shrewd, unsentimental businessmen who had orchestrated the bootlegging empires recognized the ripe opportunity for product diversification. Figures like Arnold Rothstein, the New York kingpin allegedly responsible for fixing the 1919 World Series, grasped the fundamental economics of illicit trade. Cocaine was a luxury commodity, low volume, high profit, and easily transported. It did not necessitate fleets of trucks or vast warehouses, unlike illegal spirits. A few discreet smugglers, a network of clandestine dealers, and the wealthiest, most influential strata of society could be readily supplied. The supply chains were still nascent, often relying on legitimate pharmaceutical shipments rerouted from Europe or opportunistic small-scale imports from South America. However, the foundation was being established, and the demand was solidifying. Cocaine had forged its new identity, a forbidden luxury, a powder that demarcated the daring, the decadent, and the damned from the ordinary populace. It offered a promise of energy, brilliance, and belonging, a costly promise, initially settled with cash, but inevitably paid for with other, more profound currencies. While the spirited youth of the North were discovering the illicit allure of the powder, its true genesis was unfolding far to the south, under the stark, high-altitude sun of the Andes. For centuries, the indigenous peoples of Peru and Bolivia had a relationship with the coca leaf that was anything but decadent. It was intrinsically linked to their survival. They would chew the leaves, often mixed with a touch of ash or lime, to facilitate alkaloid release, for sustenance at punishing elevations, to ward off hunger, and for both ritualistic and medicinal purposes. The coca leaf was a divine gift, a sacred plant interwoven into the very fabric of their culture, a mild stimulant as common and vital to their existence as the potato. The metamorphosis of this revered leaf into a global commodity is a narrative of chemistry, ambition, and geography. It commences not with cartels, but with quiet, enterprising chemists and smugglers who perceived an opportunity to link the ancient agricultural riches of the Andes with the world's burgeoning nervous appetites. In the mid-20th century, the initial true architects of the international cocaine trade began to surface. They were not at first the ostentatious narco-lords of later notoriety, but rather sharp, calculating businessmen operating from the shadows. For a period, the nexus of this nascent industry was not Colombia, but the lengthy coastal nation of Chile. In cities like Valparaiso and Santiago, smugglers who had honed their skills in other illicit ventures recognized the potential. A pivotal figure was a Chilean woman known as the Godmother, a restaurateur who utilized her establishment as a front to construct one of the earliest substantial trafficking networks in the 1960s. Her organization was remarkably sophisticated for its time, not merely transporting the product, but actively controlling its production.
The methodology they developed became the paradigm for the entire industry. A green alchemy transforming a green leaf into a white powder. Initially, coca leaves harvested by impoverished farmers in the remote Peruvian and Bolivian valleys were transported to crude, concealed pits in the jungle. There, they were steeped in gasoline or kerosene and macerated into a pulp, frequently by men treading on them barefoot. This slurry was then combined with acid and other chemicals to extract the raw cocaine alkaloids, yielding a granular, off-white substance known as pasta base, or coca paste. This paste served as the critical intermediate, far more compact and potent than the raw leaves, thus simplifying cross-border smuggling. The coca paste would be transported by small, rickety aircraft from the jungles of Bolivia and Peru to the arid expanses of northern Chile. Here, in clandestine laboratories, often mere shacks or concealed basements, the final, delicate stage of purification would occur. Chemists, some professionally trained, employed a volatile blend of solvents like ether and acetone to refine the coca paste, meticulously removing impurities until only pure, glistening crystals of cocaine hydrochloride remained. It was a hazardous, malodorous process. A single misstep, a stray spark, could result in the entire laboratory erupting in flames. Yet the profits were astronomical. A kilogram of coca paste, purchased for a mere few $100s in the Bolivian jungle, could be transformed into a kilogram of pure cocaine, commanding thousands of dollars in Santiago and tens of thousands in the United States or Europe. The early Chilean traffickers laid the groundwork, ferrying the finished product to staging points in Central America and the Caribbean, or employing mules, human couriers, to transport small quantities on commercial flights. They were constructing the very first iteration of a multinational supply chain centered around a single, potent product.
Then history intervened. In 1973, a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile. In the brutal subsequent crackdown, Pinochet's new regime demonstrated scant tolerance for independent criminal enterprises. Numerous established traffickers were arrested, executed, or compelled to flee, severing the Chilean connection. However, the demand for cocaine in the United States and Europe remained unabated. Indeed,
it was escalating exponentially. A vacuum had been created, and nature, particularly the nature of black markets, abhors a vacuum. The business of refining coca paste and exporting the finished product required a new locus. It found one just up the coast in a nation with a long tradition of smuggling, a weak central government, and a cohort of ambitious, utterly ruthless young men driven by a hunger for wealth and power. That nation was Colombia. The entire gravitational center of the cocaine trade shifted northward. In doing so, it set the stage for an explosion of violence and wealth previously unseen by the world. The quiet, business-like smuggling of the Chilean era was about to be supplanted by something far more monstrous. The machine was poised to be built. The men who constructed this machine were not drawn from the traditional Colombian elite. They emerged from the rough, aspirational middle classes of cities like Medellin. They were individuals who had grown up with a sense of grievance, observing the established wealth families govern the nation from their exclusive clubs and haciendas. They viewed cocaine not as a social vice, but as a historic opportunity, a vehicle for their own violent brand of upward mobility. And at the heart of this new cadre of narco-entrepreneurs stood a man whose name would become inextricably linked with the drug itself: Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Escobar was not a brilliant chemist or a master logistician, at least not initially. His genius lay in his vision and his terrifying lack of restraint. He began his career in the gritty underworld of Medellin, involved in car theft, cigarette smuggling, and ransom kidnappings. He was pragmatic, brutal, and possessed an innate understanding of the two forces that drive the world: fear and desire. When the cocaine trade began its migration from Chile, Escobar didn't merely see an opportunity to participate. He saw a chance to dominate. He understood that the true wealth lay not in moving a few kilos, but in controlling the entire production chain, from leaf to street. It was about industrializing the process. He and his associates formed what became known as the Medellin Cartel. It was less a rigid hierarchical structure and more a powerful, loosely affiliated consortium of traffickers who collaborated to maximize profits and protect their enterprise. Among them were the Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio Jr., who hailed from a family of racehorse breeders and brought a touch of old-world business acumen to the venture. There was also Carlos Lehder, a brilliant, eccentric, and volatile German Colombian who idolized both John Lennon and Adolf Hitler. Lehder's significant contribution was logistical. He acquired a small island in the Bahamas called Norman's Cay and transformed it into the ultimate smuggling depot, complete with a runway, radar system, and refrigerated warehouses. From this private sanctuary, a short flight from the Florida coast, the cartel could dispatch plane loads of cocaine directly into the insatiable American market. What Escobar and his partners accomplished was the application of industrial capitalist principles to a criminal enterprise. They achieved vertical integration, financing coca cultivation in Peru and Bolivia to ensure a consistent supply of raw material. They erected vast, sprawling laboratory complexes deep within the Colombian jungle, known as super labs. These were not mere sheds. They were akin to small cities, featuring airplane hangars, dormitories for hundreds of workers, kitchens, power generators, and sophisticated chemical processing equipment. At complexes like Tranquilandia, they could produce 10 to 20 tons of pure cocaine every single week. Tons! The sheer scale is almost incomprehensible. They were no longer merely smugglers, they were manufacturers, producing a product for a global market on an assembly line of breathtaking efficiency. The logistics of transporting the product were equally audacious. Fleets of small aircraft, each carrying several hundred kilograms, journeyed from Colombia to Norman's Cay or dropped their waterproofed cargo into the ocean to be retrieved by speedboats. They even invested in submarines, rudimentary diesel-powered vessels capable of carrying 1 or 2 tons of cocaine while submerged, rendering them nearly invisible to law enforcement. And then there was the money. The profits were so immense they constituted a logistical challenge in themselves. Billions of dollars in cash, predominantly small bills from street sales in the United States, had to be transported back to Colombia. It was stuffed into suitcases, packed into the landing gear of private jets, and concealed within televisions and refrigerators. The cartel was spending thousands of dollars monthly solely on the rubber bands required to bundle the stacks of cash. Pablo Escobar, at his zenith, was estimated to be one of the wealthiest men in the world, with a personal fortune in the tens of billions, wealthier than many nations. With this extraordinary wealth came immense power, and Escobar intended to wield it to bend the entire nation of Colombia to his will. His business strategy was simple, articulated with chilling clarity. Plata o plomo, silver or lead.
For any policeman, judge, politician, or journalist who obstructed his path, a choice was presented. One could accept a bribe, the silver, and turn a blind eye, thereby becoming wealthy in the process. Or one could refuse and face the consequence of lead, a bullet. This was a campaign of corruption and terror waged on an industrial scale. The cartel systematically infiltrated every level of the Colombian state. They had judges on their payroll who would dismiss any charges against them. They had police commanders who would provide security for their shipments. They had politicians who would block any legislation threatening their interests. Most notably the extradition treaty with the United States, which the traffickers feared more than incarceration in a Colombian prison. Escobar himself, with breathtaking arrogance, secured a seat as an alternate congressman in the Colombian Congress in 1982, seeking the legitimacy and legal immunity that came with the office. However, when charisma and cash proved insufficient, the cartel unleashed the lead, and they did so with a ferocity that plunged Colombia into a state of civil conflict. The Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who dared to denounce Escobar and strip him of his congressional immunity, was assassinated in his car in Bogotá in 1984. Luis Carlos Galán, a charismatic presidential candidate who made the fight against the cartels the cornerstone of his campaign and was the clear frontrunner to win, was murdered at a public rally in '89. They planted a bomb on Avianca Flight 203 in an attempt to assassinate another presidential candidate, Cesar Gaviria, who was not aboard, killing all 107 people on the plane. They detonated a massive truck bomb outside the headquarters of the DAS, Colombia's security agency, killing 70 people and wounding hundreds. This was not mere crime, it was narco-terrorism.
These were not the actions of a simple gang, but of a parallel state, a corporate entity with its own army and foreign policy, waging war against a sovereign nation. The Medellin cartel, under the leadership of Pablo Escobar, had transformed the humble coca leaf into a weapon of mass destabilization. They had constructed a machine that produced not just a drug, but an empire of corruption, addiction, and fear, fueled by an endless river of white powder flowing northward. An empire that held an entire country hostage, forcing its populace to make a daily choice between silver and lead. While global cameras and headlines were captivated by the volcanic, almost theatrical violence of Medellin, a distinctly different organization was quietly consolidating its power a few hundred kilometers to the south, in the sun-drenched city of Cali. If Pablo Escobar was a narco-warlord, a figure of chaotic public brutality, his rivals in Cali represented something more modern and in many respects far more insidious. They were the board of directors of a multinational corporation whose primary product was, coincidentally, cocaine. They referred to themselves as Los Caballeros de Cali, the gentlemen of Cali, and they cultivated this image with meticulous care. Theirs was not the path of the car bomb and the public assassination. Theirs was the path of the quiet bribe, the leveraged politician, the compromised judge. They understood a fundamental truth that Escobar, in his egomania, often overlooked. True power is not the ability to detonate a building, but the ability to ensure that no one is ever prosecuted for it. The cartel was a syndicate, a partnership of 4 key figures, each with a distinct specialization. At the apex were the brothers Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela. Gilberto, the elder, was known as El Ajedrecista. the chess player. He was the strategist, the visionary, the public face of their legitimate businesses. A man who moved with ease in the highest echelons of Colombian society, respected as a banker and philanthropist. His brother, Miguel, managed the operational core of the enterprise, the CEO overseeing the day-to-day logistics of a global trafficking empire. More private and more ruthless, he was the iron hand within Gilberto's velvet glove. Together they had built a business empire that began innocently enough with a chain of pharmacies, eventually expanding into banking, real estate, and even ownership of the city's beloved football team, América de Cali. These were not mere fronts. They were highly profitable, legitimate enterprises that conferred immense social and political capital upon the brothers, and crucially, provided the perfect infrastructure for laundering the billions of dollars that would soon flood in. The other two partners were specialists. Helmer Herrera, known as Pacho, was the genius of logistics and distribution. From his base in Cali, he directed the complex transportation networks that moved cocaine out of Colombia and critically managed the vast and intricate distribution cells within the United States, particularly in New York City. The fourth member was José Santa Cruz Londoño, or Chepe. He served as the cartel's ambassador and pioneer. It was Santa Cruz who in the late 1970s and early 80s personally traveled to New York to establish the foundations of their American operations. He was not a gangster kicking down doors, but a businessman opening accounts, leasing warehouses and forging alliances. He understood the American market better than anyone, grasping its rhythms, its appetites, and its vulnerabilities. The Cali model was built on intelligence and infiltration. They invested more in technology and human intelligence than in foot soldiers. Their counterintelligence capabilities were legendary, rivaling those of a national government. They systematically bribed employees of the Colombian Telephone Company, allowing them to tap nearly every phone call entering and leaving Cali. They had police officers, military commanders, politicians, and journalists on their payroll. Their spies were ubiquitous. A lawyer contemplating taking on a case against them might receive a polite phone call detailing the route his children took to school that morning. No explicit threat was necessary. The message was understood. This created a pervasive atmosphere of silence and complicity, rendering them seemingly untouchable. They operated not above the law like Escobar, but from within it, twisting its provisions to serve their objectives. Their logistical innovations were equally sophisticated. While Medellin still relied on stuffing suitcases or employing small aircraft, Cali operated on an industrial scale. They understood that the most effective way to conceal a tree is within a forest. Cocaine was dissolved in chemicals and blended with legitimate shipments. It was hidden within hollowed-out lumber, mixed into shipments of coffee beans, or secreted within concrete fence posts that were container shipped to construction companies they owned in the United States. The process of liberating these consignments from their packaging necessitated industrial facilities and chemical operations far exceeding the typical capabilities of a routine customs examination. One of their most ingenious stratagems involved dispatching thousands of containers filled with frozen broccoli to Miami. Interspersed among the legitimate produce were boxes in which the broccoli had been substituted with meticulously fabricated, green-hued facsimiles composed entirely of pure cocaine. To an inquisitive officer, it merely appeared as another pallet of frozen vegetables within a refrigerated depot housing countless similar units.
They elevated money laundering into a fine art. Their financial infrastructure spans the globe, employing an intricate network of shell companies, offshore banking establishments in Panama and the Caribbean, and legitimate enterprises to cleanse their earnings until they were indistinguishable from untainted capital. They retained the services of top-tier legal professionals and accountants to navigate and capitalize upon international financial regulations. At their absolute peak, in the early 1920s following Escobar's demise, the Cali cartel was assessed by the DEA to be responsible for 80% of the global cocaine distribution. They operated as a discrete, highly efficient, vertically integrated monopoly. a clandestine authority whose influence extended from the coca cultivation regions of the Andes to the uppermost echelons of power in Bogotá, and whose product was delivered with corporate-like precision to a market ravenously consuming it. And where did all of this meticulously packaged, industrially transported, and expertly laundered powder ultimately arrive? It flowed northward, a vast white torrent, towards a nation poised to welcome it with open arms and readily available funds. America, during the latter half of the 1970s and throughout the 1980s, was undergoing a profound societal metamorphosis. The lingering disillusionment from the Vietnam War and the pervasive cynicism stemming from the Watergate scandal were yielding to a new unreserved epoch of ambition, rampant consumerism, and self-indulgence. This was the era of Reagan, the philosophy of greed is good, the ascendancy of Wall Street magnates and blockbuster Hollywood productions. It was a time that idolized speed, success, and social standing. Cocaine, as if engineered in a laboratory specifically for this juncture, became its perfect propellant.
In stark contrast to the hallucinogens of the 1960s counterculture, such as marijuana and LSD, which were associated with disengagement and consciousness expansion, cocaine emerged as the stimulant for the upwardly mobile. It was the drug of achievers. It did not induce lethargy. It sharpened focus. It did not foster introspection. It instilled confidence. It promised enhanced wit, greater energy, increased creativity, and augmented power. It became the quintessential accoutrement for the ambitious, the young urban professionals striving to ascend the corporate hierarchy. It was a line of pristine white confidence, prepared and inhaled in a restroom stall before a critical presentation, or a small quantity applied to the gums before a high-stakes negotiation. On the frenetic trading floors of Wall Street, it served as the catalyst enabling brokers to endure 20-hour workdays, to shout into telephones, to process bewildering volumes of information, and to celebrate colossal profits with equally extravagant revelry. Within the exclusive inner sanctums of Hollywood studios, multi-million-dollar agreements were finalized over glass surfaces dusted with white powder. It was the muse for screenwriters, the rocket fuel for rock stars, and the clandestine indulgence of actors and actresses whose flawless smiles adorned magazine covers. The substance shed its disreputable back-alley image and stepped into the spotlight of elite circles. Nowhere was this transformation more vividly illustrated than at Studio 54, the iconic New York nightclub that epitomized the hedonism of the 1970s disco era. Beyond its velvet ropes, a curated universe of celebrities, fashion mavens, artists and financiers converged nightly in a spectacle of unbridled excess. And at the nexus of it all resided cocaine. It was circulated on silver platters, akin to hors d'oeuvres. The club's renowned emblem, depicting a man in the moon with a silver spoon raised to his nose, was an audacious, knowing not to the establishment's favored intoxicant. Here, cocaine was not a shameful secret. It was the social lubricant that propelled the entire glittering enterprise. It was a mark of belonging, of having arrived. The very implements of consumption evolved into status symbols. Gold razor blades for meticulously preparing lines, elegant silver spoons for discreet insufflations, and polished mirrors or marble slabs as serving platters. The rituals surrounding its use were fetishized, transforming into a performance of sophisticated decadence. Popular culture mirrored and amplified this allure. Films like Scarface, while ostensibly cautionary tales, also presented a captivating depiction of narco-fueled wealth and power. Song lyrics on the radio, either subtly or overtly, referenced the white horse or the snow that energized nightlife. It permeated every sphere. For a brief, intoxicating interval, cocaine transcended its identity as a mere drug. It became a cultural phenomenon, a symbol for success, a sacrament in the burgeoning religion of ambition. This voracious demand generated a feedback loop of astonishing potency. The more cocaine America consumed, the greater the influx of capital flowing southward. And the more money that flowed south, the more influential and sophisticated the Colombian cartels grew.
The gentlemen of Cali observed this surge in demand not with the wild-eyed desperation of street vendors, but with the cool, analytical detachment of market strategists. They intensified production, refined their logistical operations, and optimized their delivery frameworks to satisfy the needs of their most valuable and profitable clientele. The United States represented a market of unparalleled magnitude, and they were the exclusive purveyors of its most fashionable commodity.
The profits generated were beyond imagining, sufficient to fund armies, destabilize governments, and fundamentally alter entire economies. However, this aura of opulence was predicated on a chemical compound, and that compound was on the cusp of being fundamentally re-engineered. A luxury good, by its very definition, implies exclusivity, and the immutable laws of the marketplace, much like the fundamental principles of chemistry, are relentless. Sooner or later, someone, somewhere, was destined to discover a method for rendering the champagne of drugs accessible to the masses. And they did. In doing so, they unleashed a tempest that would irrevocably tear through the very fabric of American society. The chemistry involved was brutally straightforward. It demanded no intricate laboratory or skilled chemist. It could be achieved in a simple cooking pot, using common household ingredients. By taking cocaine hydrochloride, the expensive powdered form, and combining it with a basic alkaline substance like baking soda and a small quantity of water, followed by heating, one could effectively liberate the cocaine from its hydrochloride salt. As the mixture cooled, the psychoactive cocaine base would precipitate, solidifying into small crystalline fragments or chunks. The process produced a distinct crackling sound as the water evaporated, thus giving the new substance its name, crack. This simple chemical alteration proved revolutionary. Firstly, it transformed the method of administration. Unlike the powder which was snorted, crack was smoked. Inhaling the vaporized cocaine delivered the drug to the brain via the extensive surface area of the lungs within mere seconds. The outcome was an intensely euphoric rush, exponentially more potent and immediate than anything achievable through insufflation. It was an all-encompassing explosion of pleasure, a tidal wave of dopamine that users described as the most profound intoxication they had ever encountered.
Yet, this extraordinary peak was tragically ephemeral. The intense euphoria typically lasted for approximately 5 to 10 minutes, immediately followed by an equally intense descent, a plunge into dysphoria, anxiety, and an overwhelming, all-consuming craving to re-experience that euphoria. This rapid cycle of extreme highs and devastating lows engendered an addiction of unprecedented velocity and ferocity. Individuals who had merely experimented with powdered cocaine found themselves hopelessly ensnared by crack after only a few encounters. The second, and arguably more significant transformation was economic. In the mid-1980s, a gram of powdered cocaine could command a street price of $100. For many, particularly within impoverished communities, this represented a prohibitive cost, a luxury they could never afford. Crack cocaine shattered this financial barrier. That same gram of powder could be processed into numerous rocks, and a single rock could be vended for as little as $2, $3, or $5. This was the critical juncture. It was a stroke of perverse marketing brilliance. The drug was now democratized. Its price point was accessible to virtually anyone. It opened up a vast, untapped market within America's inner cities, communities already ravaged by decades of deindustrialization, white flight, and systemic neglect. The tempest struck these neighborhoods with hurricane-like force in cities such as New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. The advent of inexpensive, smokable cocaine spawned a new and terrifying economy. Street corners that once hosted local businesses or children engaged in games were instantaneously transformed into open-air drug markets operating around the clock. A new cohort of young, heavily armed street gangs emerged, engaged in brutal territorial disputes over control of this extraordinarily lucrative enterprise.
the level of violence escalated dramatically.
The discreet transaction in a nightclub restroom was supplanted by a violent confrontation on a residential street. The social fabric of these communities began to disintegrate. The crack house, an abandoned or commandeered dwelling where users could purchase and consume the drug, became a symbol of decay, a locale where all social norms dissolved. Families were fractured as addiction took hold. Parents divested their possessions and eventually themselves in pursuit of the next fleeting high, leaving their children neglected. A generation of children was born to mothers struggling with addiction, and the media, in a frenzy of moral alarm, coined the term crack babies, propagating a terrifying and often exaggerated portrayal of a generation permanently afflicted with neurological impairments. While subsequent medical research revealed a more complex and less uniformly catastrophic long-term prognosis than initially reported, the immediate social reality for these children, born into an environment of chaos, poverty, and trauma, was undeniably devastating. The response from both the media and the government was not one of public health concern, but of outright war. Evening news broadcasts were saturated with sensationalized, lurid accounts of crack-fueled violence and urban deterioration. The narrative often carried racial undertones. The drug user was no longer the glamorous Wall Street broker or Hollywood luminary, but rather a young, menacing black man. This relentless media portrayal ignited a nationwide panic, and politicians, eager to project an image of toughness on crime, hastily enacted draconian legislation. The most impactful of these measures was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This piece of legislation, passed in a surge of pre-election fervor, codified a staggering disparity in sentencing into federal law. It mandated that possession of a mere 5 grams of crack cocaine would trigger the same mandatory 5-year prison sentence as the possession of 500 grams of powdered cocaine. This became known as the infamous 100-to-1 sentencing ratio. The rationale, if one could indeed apply that term, was that crack was deemed more addictive and associated with greater violence, thus meriting a harsher penalty. The practical repercussions of this law were catastrophic and profoundly discriminatory. The typical consumer of expensive powdered cocaine was more likely to be white and from a middle-class background, and was rarely apprehended for simple possession. The typical user and low-level distributor of inexpensive crack cocaine was far more likely to be impoverished and of African American descent, and was subjected to aggressive street-level policing. The outcome was the mass incarceration of an entire generation of young black men. Prison populations across the United States surged. Families were devastated not only by addiction, but by a punitive justice system that confined fathers, sons, and brothers for years, sometimes decades, for nonviolent drug offenses. The law did little to curtail the flow of narcotics, but succeeded in decimating already vulnerable communities, deepening cycles of poverty, and fostering a profound and enduring sense of injustice. Thus, the narrative of cocaine in America evolved into a chronicle of two starkly contrasting worlds, dictated by chemistry and socioeconomic status. In the opulent penthouses of Manhattan, it remained a discreet, albeit risky, indulgence, the powder that fueled ambition and excess. However, in the low-income housing projects of the South Bronx, its more economical, smokable manifestation became an emblem of societal collapse, a catalyst for a war on drugs that, in practice, was a war on the impoverished.
Two facets of the same white coin. One, celebrated as the fuel of the elite, the other, demonized as the poison of the underclass. It represented the ultimate tragic manifestation of a powder that for a century had deceived the world with its promise of power, only to ultimately deliver ruin in its wake. The gentlemen in Cali, poring over their spreadsheets and financial statements, likely paid scant attention to the specific form their product assumed once it reached the American consumer. To them, it was merely a matter of market share, of meeting demand, of figures on a page. Yet, the numbers on the street told a vastly different story. A narrative of chemistry, economics, and a profound,
unfolding American tragedy. And so, within the grand theater of public policy, the curtain ascended upon a new and formidable act. The shimmering white powder, once the darling of intellectuals and the propellant of high society, had morphed into a new, more volatile iteration. Rendered into a hard, inexpensive substance through boiling with baking soda and water, it became something that could be smoked. It was christened crack, and it blazed through America's inner cities like a phantom inferno, leaving behind a trail of social devastation. The media, never one to shy away from a compelling panic, fanned the flames with nightly depictions of so-called crack babies and chaotic urban landscapes. The public demanded action, and in Washington, a city powered by the twin forces of fear and opportunity, swift action was delivered. The adversary was no longer a personal failing or a social malady. It had become an existential threat, necessitating a declaration of war. This was not the first instance of the phrase's deployment, of course. Richard Nixon had coined it years prior, but his declared war was a bureaucratic endeavor involving treatment centers and commissions. The war of the 1980s, amplified by the crack epidemic, was different. It was a literal conflict, complete with military personnel and fatalities. It commenced, as many such undertakings do, with a legislative document, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, a product of moral certainty and electoral calculation. It stood as a masterpiece of legislative fervor. At its core lay the concept of mandatory minimum sentencing. The nuanced art of judicial discretion was unceremoniously discarded in favor of a rigid, brutal arithmetic. The possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine, roughly the weight of 2 sugar packets, guaranteed a minimum of 5 years in federal prison. To incur the same sentence for powdered cocaine, the preferred substance in wealthier, whiter, suburban areas, one would need to be apprehended with 500 grams, establishing a 100-to-1 disparity enshrined in law. The logic was simple and tragically flawed. Crack was perceived as more addictive, more violent, and more associated with urban environments. The law did not merely target a substance, it targeted a demographic. The machinery of the state began to engage, grinding with a new and terrifying force. The lines between policing and military operations blurred. Surplus military equipment, once destined for foreign battlefields, began to trickle, then flow, into the arsenals of local police departments. Armored personnel carriers, M16 rifles, flashbang grenades. The familiar neighborhood officer was supplanted by a new figure, a warrior clad in black Kevlar, a ballistic helmet, and equipped for a small-scale invasion. The primary tactic of this new war was the no-knock raid. In the dead of night, doors would splinter, families would be forced to the floor, and homes ransacked in search of that crystalline rock or white powder. The conflict unfolded not in trenches, but within living rooms and bedrooms across the nation. And, like any proper war, it possessed a foreign front.
The rationale was straightforward supply-side economics, filtered through the lens of military strategy. If the domestic demand was insatiable, then the sole recourse was to choke off the supply at its origin. All attention shifted southward, towards the verdant valleys of the Andes and the humid jungles of the Amazon basin, where the humble coca leaf was cultivated. The United States, through the Drug Enforcement Administration and the CIA, commenced pouring billions of dollars into Latin America. The policy bore a clean, almost agricultural designation, eradication, yet its implementation was far from benign. Low-flying aircraft, frequently piloted by American contractors, would traverse the Colombian and Peruvian countryside, dispensing a fine mist of glyphosate herbicide. This chemical concoction, known as Roundup, was designed to destroy coca plants. It fulfilled its purpose, but lacked discernment. It also decimated yucca, coffee, and banana crops. It contaminated watersheds and sickened livestock. It drove subsistence farmers, who grew coca purely because it offered the only guarantee of a livelihood,
deeper into poverty, and into the embrace of the very traffickers the program aimed to dismantle. Furthermore, the US armed and trained local military forces, effectively transforming national armies into proxies in the war on drugs. They constructed radar installations, supplied Black Hawk helicopters, and shared intelligence to hunt down the so-called kingpins. The paramount instrument of this foreign policy was extradition. The threat of being transported northward in chains to face trial in an American courtroom, far removed from judges who could be bribed and witnesses who could be intimidated, was the sole apprehension that truly gripped cartel leaders. Pablo Escobar, the monarch of Medellin, famously declared he would rather have a tomb in Colombia than a prison cell in the United States.
He waged a brutal terroristic campaign against his own government to avert this fate, orchestrating bombings and assassinations of presidential candidates. He and his adversaries within the Cali cartel were the principal targets. Their visages were plastered across television screens as the faces of the enemy, their immense wealth and casual brutality serving as the perfect antagonists in this global drama. And gradually, painstakingly, the strategy appeared to yield results. Through a combination of relentless pursuit, internal betrayals, and violent confrontations, the formidable Colombian cartels of the late 20th century were dismantled. Escobar met his end in a rooftop shootout in Medellin in 1993. The leaders of the Cali cartel were apprehended or surrendered a few years later. From the Situation Rooms in the White House to the DEA field offices in Bogotá, a palpable sense of triumph pervaded. The heads of the serpent had been severed, but it seemed no one inquired about the fate of its body. It appeared no one noticed that while they had been engaged in one conflict, they had inadvertently cultivated the ideal environment for a more formidable monster to emerge from the ashes. The previous system possessed a certain brutal clarity. The Colombians, the cartels of Medellin and Cali, were the producers and wholesalers. They controlled the entire process, from the coca paste laboratories in the jungle to the multi-ton shipments dispatched northward by air or sea. However, they had a critical vulnerability, the final, most perilous leg of the journey, the 954 miles of the US-Mexico border. It was a porous, treacherous expanse of desert scrub and shallow rivers, a territory they neither knew nor controlled. For this concluding delivery, they required specialists. They needed subcontractors. Consequently, they turned to the organizations that had been engaged in smuggling contraband across that border for generations. Small-time trafficking families from Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Baja California, who were intimately familiar with the routes, the patrol patterns of the border guard, and the corruptibility of officials on both sides. Initially, the arrangement was straightforward. The Mexicans were compensated with a fixed fee for their services, a few $1,000s in cash for every kilogram of cocaine they successfully transported into the United States. They served as couriers, truck drivers, and mules. They were logistical operatives, nothing more. The individual who first recognized the inherent value in this established system was a former law enforcement officer from Sinaloa, identified as Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. He was widely known by the moniker El Padrino, signifying the Godfather. Unlike figures such as Escobar, he was not characterized by an ostentatious display of violence. Instead, he was a shrewd businessman and a visionary. His insight was that true influence resided not in the cultivation of the substance, but in the meticulous control of its journey to the marketplace. He successfully unified disparate and struggling smuggling factions into a singular, cohesive confederation known as the Guadalajara Cartel. His domain encompassed the plazas, which were the highly profitable transit routes essential for the clandestine movement of goods into the United States. For a period, this meticulously crafted system operated with remarkable efficiency, benefiting all involved parties. The Colombian organization secured a dependable distribution network, while Felix Gallardo's enterprise amassed considerable wealth through transportation fees. However,
The escalating intensity of the global war on drugs began to fundamentally alter this equilibrium.
As the United States and Colombian authorities relentlessly pursued figures like Escobar and the Rodriguez brothers of the Cali cartel, their operations became increasingly fragmented, their financial streams disrupted, and their desperation palpable. This very desperation created an unforeseen opportunity for Felix Gallardo and his associates. The Mexican operatives began to renegotiate the terms of their agreement. They no longer desired cash payments, which were cumbersome to transport and complex to legitimize. Instead, they sought an asset of far greater value, a stake in the product itself. Forsaking direct monetary compensation, they started demanding payment in kind, taking a 35%, then a 40%, and ultimately a 50% share of every cocaine shipment they facilitated. This represented a masterful strategic maneuver, a silent upheaval within the illicit economy. With this single transformative shift, the Mexican organizations were fundamentally reshaped. They transcended their former role as mere intermediaries. They were now wholesale distributors, possessing their own inventory, their own merchandise to market, and direct access to the largest consumer base on the planet. Consequently, they initiated the development of their own distribution infrastructures within American cities, effectively bypassing the Colombian intermediaries entirely. The dismantling of the prominent Colombian cartels, hailed as a monumental triumph in Washington, inadvertently created an immense power void. Into this void emerged the newly empowered Mexican federations. The apprehension of Felix Gallardo in 1989, a direct consequence of the political maelstrom surrounding the torture and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, did not halt the intricate network he had established. Instead, it merely prompted its fragmentation into its constituent independent components, each solidifying into a formidable entity in its own right.
The original Guadalajara cartel fractured, giving rise to the cartels that are recognized today. In the northwestern region, the audacious and brutal Arellano Felix brothers seized control of the Tijuana Plaza, a lucrative entry point into California. Centrally, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, known as the Lord of the Skies, due to his impressive fleet of Boeing 727s used to transport cocaine directly from Colombia, assumed dominion over the Juarez Plaza. And in the mountainous terrain of Sinaloa, a farmer's son, though of diminutive stature, possessed of boundless ambition, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman Loera, began to consolidate his influence alongside his partners, forging what would eventually become the Sinaloa cartel. The fundamental dynamics had been irreversibly altered. The Colombians, once the undisputed rulers of the trade, were now relegated to the status of mere suppliers, compelled to sell their product to the Mexicans at its origin. The Mexicans now held sway over the entirety of the logistical pipeline north of Colombia, dictating the routes, the pricing, and the profits. They were no longer subcontractors. They had ascended to the role of the board of directors. A new narco empire had been established, with its spiritual center in Culiacan and its operational outposts in Tijuana, Juarez, and Matamoros. These entities were wealthier, more sophisticated, and more deeply entrenched than their Colombian predecessors had ever been. The relentless campaign to neutralize the kingpins of Medellin and Cali had not extinguished the monarchy. It had merely paved the way for a new, more potent dynasty to ascend to the throne. The United States, after a decade and billions of dollars spent vanquishing a single adversary, had inadvertently spawned a hydra, a monstrous new entity growing directly on its doorstep. The immense river of wealth flowing northward was now mirrored by an equally vast torrent of capital flowing southward.
Tens of billions of dollars annually, a financial influx surpassing the gross domestic product of numerous smaller nations, poured back into Mexico. This unprecedented financial prosperity
facilitated a final, terrifying metamorphosis for the cartels. They began to evolve beyond the confines of conventional criminal enterprises, transcending their roles as mere traffickers to become something entirely different, a parallel state, a narco-state, existing in tandem with and within the legitimate Mexican government, at times collaborating, at other times clashing, but always undermining its authority. This evolution commenced with corruption, an age-old practice elevated to an industrial scale. Officials at every level, from the local constable to the federal prosecutor, from the municipal mayor to the cabinet minister, were presented with a stark and brutal choice: plata o plomo, meaning silver or lead, a briefcase overflowing with currency, or a coffin bearing their remains. The vast majority opted for the silver. Police departments effectively became private security forces for the cartels. Military commanders divulged sensitive intelligence regarding troop movements, and politicians enacted legislation favoring their illicit patrons. The corruption became so pervasive and systemic that it ceased to be an anomaly. It became the operational framework. The state was not merely infiltrated, it was co-opted, its institutions hollowed out and repurposed to serve the interests of the illicit trade. However, the narco-state's foundation extends beyond mere bribery. In many rural regions of Mexico, neglected by the central government, the local cartel effectively functioned as the de facto authority, providing essential services. When a farmer encountered a dispute with a neighbor, recourse was not sought from the police. Instead, they approached the local cartel leader.
The cartel undertook infrastructure projects such as paving roads, funded the construction of churches, sponsored local festivals, and distributed financial aid to impoverished residents. They offered employment opportunities in a country with limited prospects and dispensed a form of swift, albeit often brutal, justice. They effectively became the government, the bank, and the social safety net, all rolled into one. Their influence was not merely about securing silence. It was about cultivating loyalty, integrating themselves inextricably into the social fabric of the communities they governed. This societal control constituted the soft power that complemented their formidable hard power. Their armament capabilities became truly extraordinary. The cartels began to equip themselves not as common criminals, but as military forces. They established training facilities in remote mountainous and jungle regions, often led by former Special Forces operatives from Mexico, Guatemala, and even the United States. A new organization, Los Zetas, exemplifies this paradigm shift. They were not conventional smugglers who resorted to violence. They were professional purveyors of violence who had entered the realm of smuggling. Originally formed as an elite enforcement arm for the Gulf Cartel, drawn from a cadre of deserters from the Mexican Army's Airborne Special Forces Unit, the Zetas introduced an unprecedented level of military discipline and technological sophistication to the underworld. They pioneered the use of military tactics for coordinated assaults, employed encrypted communication systems, and fully embraced terrorism as a control mechanism. Their arsenals were astonishing. They acquired 50 caliber sniper rifles capable of disabling vehicle engines, rocket-propelled grenades, automatic grenade launchers, and even anti-aircraft weaponry. They constructed their own armored combat vehicles, dubbed monstruos, monsters, by welding thick steel plating onto heavy-duty trucks, creating rudimentary yet effective personnel carriers. They engaged the Mexican military in direct confrontations that often persisted for hours and sometimes days. They successfully downed helicopters and imposed blockades on entire cities. The traditional lines of conflict became hopelessly blurred. This was no longer a matter of law enforcement. It had devolved into a low-intensity civil war, fought street by street in urban centers such as Juarez, Tijuana, and Culiacan. The most chilling manifestation of this power
unfolded in October of 2019. The Mexican military, with intelligence support from the United States, initiated an operation in Culiacan, the heart of the Sinaloa cartel's territory, with the objective of apprehending Ovidio Guzman, one of El Chapo's sons. They achieved initial success. Within minutes, however, the city erupted in chaos. Hundreds of heavily armed and impeccably coordinated cartel gunmen flooded the streets. They erected fiery roadblocks, launched assaults on military installations, seized control of the city's airport, and took the families of soldiers hostage. The city was effectively paralyzed, besieged from within. The ensuing combat was broadcast live across social media platforms, a stark spectacle of governmental failure. The Mexican security forces found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and utterly overwhelmed. After hours of intense fighting, the order to stand down and release Guzman came directly from the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in an effort to prevent further loss of life. The cartel had prevailed. They had confronted the full might of the Mexican state in open warfare and compelled its retreat. This event represented a moment of profound humiliation for the government and a terrifying revelation to the world.
It demonstrated that in certain regions of Mexico, the state's exclusive right to employ violence, the very cornerstone of the national sovereignty, had effectively dissolved. The narco-state was no longer a shadowy entity. It was the tangible reality. In the streets of Culiacan, for one blood-soaked afternoon, it was the sole governing power. The illicit trade had done more than merely corrupt a few officials. It had financed an insurgency that now held a nation captive, a silent, insidious conquest financed 1 gram at a time. The American market, despite its insatiable demand, had reached its saturation point. By the late 1980s, and throughout the 1990s, American cities were awash in cocaine. Prices had stabilized, competition was cutthroat, and law enforcement, though often struggling, was beginning to exert a more consistent pressure. The Colombian cartels, ever attuned to the fundamental principles of global commerce, recognized a crucial business tenet: market diversification. They required a new frontier, a new continent of consumers whose wallets could be opened and whose nostrils could be filled. Their attention thus turned eastward, across the vast and desolate expanse of the Atlantic, towards the Old World. Europe, with its affluent urban centers, its established trade networks, and its own discrete proclivities, represented the next logical target. This marked the inauguration of a second front, a European corridor that would fundamentally alter the global distribution of illicit substances and entangle an entirely new cast of characters in its unfolding narrative. Initially, the methods employed were almost quaintly straightforward. A courier would embark on a commercial flight from Bogotá to Madrid, their luggage lined with a few carefully compressed kilograms, or small shipments would be concealed within containers of coffee beans or bananas destined for the ports of Lisbon or Naples. These were initial probes, exploratory ventures into a new market, designed to assess the defenses and ascertain the demand. However, the Colombians swiftly learned that Europe was not America. The border controls differed, the linguistic landscape was more complex, and law enforcement agencies operated as a fragmented mosaic of jurisdictions. They could not simply replicate the Miami model. They required partners, individuals possessing local knowledge and expertise. Consequently, they entered into an alliance with the most experienced and formidable organized crime syndicate in Europe. This was an organization that made the Sicilians of Cosa Nostra appear almost flamboyant and reckless by comparison. They hailed from Calabria, the mountainous southern region of Italy's boot, the 'Ndrangheta. For decades, the 'Ndrangheta had operated from the shadows, a sprawling, clan-based hydra whose tendrils extended from their provincial heartlands to the financial metropolises of northern Italy and across the globe. They were masters of logistics, particularly maritime operations. Through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and legitimate business fronts, they exerted control over the colossal container port of Joya Toro. This facility presented an ideal gateway,
A container ship arriving from South America could offload tens of thousands of containers. The task of identifying a single box containing cocaine, hidden amongst shipments of frozen poultry or industrial machinery, was virtually impossible for customs officials, especially when port employees and transport union officials were on the Ndrangheta's payroll. The partnership proved to be a model of criminal efficiency. The Colombians assumed responsibility for production and transatlantic shipping.
The Ndrangheta guaranteed secure passage into Europe through ports such as Joya Toro, Rotterdam, or Antwerp, and subsequently leveraged their extensive, deeply embedded networks to distribute the product across the continent. This represented a more discreet, more corporate arrangement compared to the violent street conflicts of Medellin. It was predicated on shared risk and astronomical profits. The Ndrangheta proved to be impeccably reliable partners. They met their payment obligations promptly, refrained from excessive inquiries, and demonstrated a level of professionalism in moving vast quantities of product that the Colombians deeply respected. Soon, hundreds of kilograms transformed into tons. The European cocaine market experienced an explosive expansion. From the financial institutions of London and Zurich to the vibrant nightlife of Amsterdam and Berlin, the white powder became the pervasive fuel for the continent's high-octane lifestyle. However, as the volume increased, direct transit routes became increasingly perilous. European authorities, now cognizant of the escalating problem, began to enhance their coordination. Maritime patrols intensified, and port security measures were bolstered. The traffickers, in their characteristic fashion, adapted. They consulted a map and identified a solution, a geographical stepping stone that served as both a shield and a shortcut. They recognized West Africa. The coastline, stretching from Senegal to Nigeria, transformed into the world's premier transit hub for cocaine. It was a smuggler's haven, a region of breathtaking natural beauty, yet marred by poverty, political instability, and porous borders. Nations like Guinea-Bissau, a small country crippled by coups and corruption, effectively became the first true narco-states outside of Latin America. The logic employed by the traffickers was simple and brutal.
A large mother ship such as a freighter or a fishing trawler would sail from the coasts of Colombia or Venezuela. Far out in international waters off the coast of Cape Verde or Guinea, it would rendezvous with smaller, faster vessels. The cocaine, sealed in waterproof bales, would be transferred. These smaller boats would then make swift voyages to shore, landing on remote beaches or navigating up forgotten rivers where they would be met by local crews. Once on African soil, the contraband was considered secure. It could be stored in warehouses in Bissau or Conakry, under the protection of bribed officials or private militias. The region already possessed established and sophisticated smuggling networks, honed over decades of moving illicit goods ranging from diamonds to cigarettes to human beings. Cocaine was simply another commodity. From West Africa, numerous routes led into Europe. The product could be repackaged and transported on commercial flights by legions of couriers. It could be concealed within cargo planes carrying fish or fruit to Paris and Brussels. In a particularly audacious maneuver, it could be flown directly into the heart of Europe on private jets, phantom flights, that filed false flight plans and landed at small, poorly monitored airfields in Spain or Portugal. The sheer ingenuity of these operations was remarkable. They utilized semi-submersible vessels, low-profile drone submarines capable of carrying several tons of cocaine, gliding silently beneath the waves, rendering them almost undetectable by radar or sonar. The European corridor had evolved from a singular path into a complex, multi-layered network, a circulatory system pumping a white poison into the continent's bloodstream. And the Ndrangheta were not the sole participants for long. The power vacuum left by the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the ensuing chaos of the Yugoslav wars had given rise to a new generation of ruthlessly efficient criminal organizations.
Balkan syndicates, particularly Serbian and Albanian groups, established themselves as significant players in the illicit trade. They were characterized by their discipline, multilingualism, and extreme violence. They specialized in overland logistics, transporting cocaine from southern ports of entry northward in trucks, traversing the seamlessly borderless expanse of the Schengen area. They exerted control over street-level distribution in cities across Germany, Scandinavia, and the United Kingdom. In the port cities of Antwerp and Rotterdam, the logistical nexus of Europe, the so-called Mokro Mafia, largely composed of Dutch-Moroccan criminals, engaged in fierce battles for control of the docks, their rivalries frequently manifesting in a series of shocking public assassinations. Europe's traditional serenity was shattered. The continent was now embroiled in its own cocaine war, perhaps less overt than those in Colombia, but equally corrosive, transforming port cities into battlegrounds and remote African villages into hubs of global criminal activity. The adaptable contraband had found its new domain. As the 21st century progressed, the very nature of the substance itself began to undergo a transformation. The narrative took a darker turn, not within the Andean jungles or the corporate boardrooms of the cartels, but in clandestine laboratories situated far afield, within the very chemistry of the drugs themselves. A new specter had emerged, a synthetic phantom that would inextricably link itself to the cocaine trade with devastating repercussions. Its name was fentanyl. It began subtly, as an infrequent mention in coroners' reports and toxicology screens during the mid-2010s. A cocaine overdose, but with anomalous findings. The victim had not simply succumbed to cardiac arrest, the typical outcome of cocaine intoxication. They had, instead, seemingly faded away, exhibiting respiratory depression, the telltale sign of opioid involvement. Initially, it was attributed to users combining drugs, a speedball of cocaine and heroin. However, the cases began to multiply, and the victims were often individuals with no prior history of opioid use. They were casual users, partygoers, individuals who believed they were purchasing a gram of cocaine for an evening's enjoyment. They had no inkling that they were ingesting one of the most potent opioids ever synthesized by humankind. Fentanyl is a laboratory creation, a purely synthetic substance first developed in 1959 as a powerful anesthetic for surgical procedures. It is 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. A dose equivalent to 2 grains of salt can prove fatal to an individual with no opioid tolerance. For contemporary drug syndicates, particularly the Mexican cartels, who had by then largely supplanted the Colombians as the dominant force in the North American market, fentanyl represented a business marvel. Its precursor chemicals could be sourced affordably from China. It could be manufactured in rudimentary laboratories, eliminating the need for extensive agricultural plantations, the management of cocoa farmers, or seasonal harvests. And its potency served as its greatest economic advantage. A single kilogram of pure fentanyl, costing a few $1,000s to produce, could be diluted and stretched to yield hundreds of thousands of individual doses for street distribution. The contamination of the cocaine supply stemmed from this cold, calculated market logic. At times, it occurred inadvertently. A dealer might use the same scale or mixing surface for both fentanyl-laced heroin and cocaine. A minuscule, invisible residue was all that was required. Increasingly, however, the contamination became deliberate. Cutting cocaine with a cheap, potent, and intensely addictive synthetic opioid proved to be a monstrously effective business strategy.
It allowed for the dilution of expensive cocaine, thereby increasing profit margins. Furthermore, for those who survived, it could foster a new and powerful dependency, hooking users on opioids without their awareness. The euphoric rush of cocaine would be followed by the heavy narcotic pull of fentanyl, a confusing and often terrifying combination. The user would then crave that specific sensation again, seeking out the same dealer, their brain chemistry now fundamentally altered by a substance they never intended to consume. The public health consequences were catastrophic. The user base for cocaine is fundamentally distinct from that of heroin. Many are recreational users who associate their drug of choice with energy, confidence, and late-night activities.
They possess no understanding of opioid overdose, no naloxone readily available, and no comprehension of the risk of respiratory arrest. The party drug had devolved into a game of Russian roulette. A single line, a single snort at a bar or concert, could now prove fatal. The third wave of the opioid crisis had officially begun, and it was a wave that swept over everyone. In the United States, the number of fatalities stemming from drug overdoses, which had already been on the rise due to prescription medications and heroin, surged to unprecedented levels. Over 100,000 Americans were succumbing annually, a figure once thought impossible. A significant and escalating portion of these tragedies involved cocaine tainted with fentanyl. This new reality reshaped everything. It fundamentally altered the risk assessment for countless individuals. Every street-level distributor became a potential harbinger of death, regardless of their awareness.
Mexican cartels, predominantly the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, emerged as the principal producers of this deadly substance, pressing it into counterfeit pharmaceutical pills and blending it with heroin, methamphetamine, and, of course, cocaine. They inundated the United States with it, leveraging the same sophisticated smuggling routes they had refined over decades. The powder, once synonymous with prestige and achievement, the indulgence of Wall Street professionals and Hollywood celebrities, became inextricably linked to a synthetic killer that was devastating communities with the swift and merciless efficiency of a pandemic. The profound illusion of cocaine had entered its most perilous stage. The allure of an exhilarating high was now overshadowed by the ever-present, unpredictable, and silent threat of demise. The individual seeking a temporary escape or a rush of excitement was essentially gambling with their life, unaware that the odds had been manipulated in a laboratory thousands of miles away. The white powder was no longer merely a drug, it was a potential vehicle for poison, a clandestine carrier of history's most potent synthetic opioid. And so we reached the conclusion of our extended, somber journey, left to survey the devastation. A century marked by aspiration, avarice, brutality, and hopelessness, all revolving around a simple alkaloid extracted from a mountain plant. The enduring impact of cocaine is not truly chronicled in historical records. It is imprinted upon the very earth, woven into the fabric of societies, and interred within millions of burial sites. It is a testament to bloodshed and powder. First, consider the land. The Amazonian basin, the planet's vital organ, bears profound and lasting wounds. For every acre dedicated to coca cultivation, several more are obliterated. The process commences with destructive agricultural practices. Ancient woodlands are cleared by fire and machete to make way for the illicit harvest. These cultivation sites deplete the delicate soil within mere years, compelling the farmers to relocate, pushing ever deeper into the rainforest, leaving behind a landscape of ruin. However, the destruction does not cease with the felling of the trees. The transformation of coca leaves into cocaine paste, the initial phase in producing the final white powder, constitutes a form of environmental chemical warfare. This is not a clean chemical process. It unfolds in rudimentary, clandestine laboratories within the jungle, utilizing a noxious concoction of chemicals. Rivers of gasoline or kerosene are employed to extract the alkaloid from the leaves. Vats of sulfuric acid, caustic soda, and potassium permanganate are used in the purification. And upon completion, where do these toxic agents end up? They are simply discarded, poured directly onto the forest floor, where they sterilize the soil, or channeled into the nearest waterway, which then carries them into the vast river systems of the Amazon and the Orinoco. They decimate aquatic life, contaminate the water consumed by remote communities, and create extensive lifeless zones in what was once Earth's most biologically diverse ecosystem. For every gram of cocaine consumed in an upscale club in a distant metropolis, a commensurate quantity of poison has been unleashed into the heart of the planet. It is a silent, continuous ecological catastrophe, the concealed environmental toll of a worldwide habit. Then there is the legacy of corruption, the erosion of nations from within. Cocaine currency acts as a universal solvent. It disintegrates institutions,
undermines allegiances and corrodes the very concept of a functioning civil society. In nations such as Colombia during the 1980s and 90s, and Mexico in the 2000s and onward, the cartels attained a level of power that rivaled that of the state.
They did not merely engage in bribery. They established a parallel governmental structure. They presented officials, judges, mayors, and presidential hopefuls with two stark alternatives: wealth or destruction, a briefcase brimming with cash or a casket. Many opted for the former, and entire government agencies, police forces, and judicial systems became effectively absorbed into the narco enterprise. Those who chose the latter, the courageous, the upright, paid with their lives, their assassinations serving as a grim deterrent to anyone who dared to obstruct them. This engenders a destructive, self-sustaining cycle. The state, weakened by corruption and fear, proves incapable of providing security or justice for its populace. Citizens then turn to the local narcotics lord, who imposes his own brutal brand of order, funding the construction of schools and churches with illicit earnings, while orchestrating the murders of his rivals in public spaces. The distinction between governance and organized crime dissolves entirely. A narco-state is born. This is not solely a Latin American phenomenon. Its detrimental influence has been observed in West Africa, where drug money has financed coups and sustained kleptocratic regimes. The powder corrupts everything it touches, fostering a world of phantoms. Phantom politicians, phantom law enforcement, phantom economies, all animated by the unceasing influx of illicit funds. And finally, there is the human cost. A price so immense, it defies easy comprehension. It is a hierarchy of suffering. At the very base is the coca farmer, the individual cultivating the plant. They are not kingpins. They are typically impoverished peasants, ensnared by economic and geographical circumstances, cultivating the sole crop that ensures a livelihood, however modest. They live under the oppressive influence of traffickers on one side and government eradication units on the other. Their existence is a perpetual negotiation with violence. Above them are the chemists laboring in jungle laboratories, inhaling toxic vapors, their lives deemed expendable. And then come the mules, the desperate young men and women who ingest condoms filled with cocaine or affix it to their bodies, fervently hoping to evade capture and praying the packages will not rupture internally. A horrific and certain demise. And there is the violence, the sicarios, the teenage assassins, frequently recruited from impoverished neighborhoods for whom life holds little value and murder is merely a profession. The unending conflicts between cartels vying for control of smuggling routes, which bear no resemblance to conventional warfare. They are extermination campaigns characterized by torture, mutilation, and public displays of barbarity, designed to instill terror in rivals and the general populace alike. The hundreds of thousands of lives lost in Mexico alone, the generations in Colombia who knew only perpetual conflict, the communities in urban America devastated by the crack cocaine epidemic, and the ensuing gang warfare. It has fueled these tragedies. The cost is measured in fatalities, but also in the traumatized survivors, the orphan children, the displaced families, the millions whose lives have been irrevocably shattered by this illicit trade. And at the apex of this pyramid sits the consumer. In a sense, they too are victims, ensnared by the grip of a powerful addiction. However, they are also the driving force, the casual user at a social gathering, the addict lurking in a darkened alley, the financier celebrating a successful transaction. Their demand sends ripples that resonate all the way down the supply chain, initiating the operation of this infernal apparatus. Their currency serves as the fuel, cocaine's ultimate stratagem. Its most profound and enduring deception was to mask this global pyramid of misery as a mere line of white powder on a reflective surface. It promised power,
exhilaration, and glamour.
Yet its true enduring legacy is one of ravaged landscapes, fractured nations, and a death toll that will likely never be fully tallied. A legacy of bloodshed and powder, perpetually regenerated as long as the world continues to desire it.